5:13, Yeshua tells his disciples, I don't know if he said that in Greek, probably not, but in Greek it says, Toalas tes ges. You're the salt of the earth. Halas tes ges, the salt of the earth. Now, what in the world did he mean by calling them the salt? Now, obviously, he's not name calling, right? He's not saying something mean. He says, you are, and then fill in the blank, right? So he calls them the salt of the earth. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Well, obviously, I would probably say it's a good thing. Most of us can guess it's a good thing. It's the middle of a teaching. It's the middle of a drash. It's the middle of a sermon. He's not chastising them. So he's saying good things about them. Now, to fully appreciate what he says, I believe that the Master's words, we must consider them in their cultural context. That is where all good things are often buried. What did the salt mean for ancient people in the Mediterranean? Now, I know what it means to you most of the time. Okay, I live in the same world you live in, and a lot of times we have the same context about salt. But what did salt mean for ancient people? Because you might be surprised, the life of the ancient people is so different from ours. So we got to ask these questions. He's not speaking to a 21st century crowd. So he's talking to ancient people. What did it mean for ancient people? Yeah.
First of all, it was a completely indispensable commodity. You had to have it to have a civilization. You had to preserve your food. I mean, it wasn't just for seasoning. I mean, you needed it to have a settlement.
You got it. It's a necessity of life. It's a staple.
Like toilet paper.
Like toilet paper, yeah. It's like, yeah, we can't probably live without salt today. Most you and I could probably figure out some other ways to live without salt, but in the ancient world, not quite possible.
And yet, it was a necessity at the same time. It's extremely valuable because it was hard to get, to the point where they paid the Roman soldiers their salary in salt.
And salt, excellent. Good point. Good point. Exactly. Yeah. That's awesome. You're stealing my thunder. Some people don't know this. Yeah, Latin helps us out a little bit here. Awesome. So these are good ideas. So let's remember the text just a little bit. Most of you guys probably are familiar with this one, right? You probably got one of those at home, right? Okay. That's why I threw it up on the screen. So let's remember the text. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Now, a lot of times when people talk about the salt of the earth, they talk about this effect of salt becoming not salty. And I don't know if you ever heard any explanations about it. Most of them I've heard many times, and most of them are just kind of really off the mark. It really has something to do often about people being disinherited or dispossessed. And this is Yeshua's warning to Israel that, hey, you're going to be thrown underfoot and trampled. I heard all kinds of things. Okay, that's not what it's about, because I'm going to tell you a couple of facts about salt. Biblical Hebrew, salt is melach. Okay, halas is Greek, but melach is Hebrew. And so in ancient Israel, it is an indestructible mineral, essentially. That's how people saw it. Indestructible. That is, the idea of salt losing its saltiness makes absolutely no sense. Because it can't. It simply can't. So you have to understand that's a rhetorical ploy. It's just Yeshua saying, what happens if the salt loses saltiness? Well, we all know it's not going to happen. Because it doesn't happen. So it's a rhetorical kind of question, and it's a rhetorical answer. Well, if it loses its saltiness, then it's no good, then we just throw it on our feet because it's just dirt, right? Because that's what we do with stuff that's useless, is dirt. But people make all kind of big deal about salt losing its saltiness. It can't. It really, as a chemical compound, it retains it.
Sodium chloride does not, is really stable.
Right. So very, very stable. That's the idea. It's indestructible. It's by virtue of being what it is. Now, salt is very valuable, as we already mentioned that. Its production was controlled by the ruling elites, the entire Mediterranean region. The elites controlled all of the salt production. They held it tightly. Why? Because it's a staple of life. If I control your electricity and air and water, guess who you come to for those things? And that means I'm in control of everything that you need in your life, right? So you get the idea. That's why the elites wanted to hold on to salt. Now, it was used as a fertilizer, sometimes in moderation. It was used as a food preservative, as a seasoning. It was used as well. These are the common uses of salt we know. about. Now, the English word salary, as you know it today, comes from Latin word salarium, which means salt money. Okay, so people literally could be paid in salt.
A bit more recent, but I saw a video recently during the Revolutionary War. Part of the British strategy was to cut off the colonials from their salt supply.
Right.
So they wouldn't be able to preserve food and supply the army.
Yeah, you have no salt, you go hungry. That's the idea. I mean, in the world without refrigeration. Here's what I'm trying to say, and maybe this will help us to kind of put things in perspective. Even the word salary and things like that, it's not meaning idiomatically, literally like salt money, like I'm giving you money because you're going to eat salt, you know. Or it's an idiomatic way of talking. Essentially, if you want to understand how the word salt was used, sometimes idiomatically it was used for food. It's a staple. It's like bread money or milk money, right? When you get milk money and you go to school, you're not going to really buy milk, right? But it's called milk money, right? When you think about it, kids, for lunch, you give them milk money, right? They're not going to buy milk. They're going to buy a candy bar or whatever they decide to buy. But the idea, you know, it's idiomatic. It's not meant to be fully understood. It's colloquial, and it's not meant to be fully understood in a literal sense. All right, so let's keep moving along. So here's a little quote for you. You know, I'm going to bring you all sorts of materials, of course, from Antiquity, because I want you to understand how salt was understood in the ancient world. So here's an example from the ancient world. Josephus in Antiquities, he's a first century writer. He writes, this is a letter from Antiochus III. You might be surprised. This is Antiochus IV's father. A very complete turnaround, by the way. This guy actually loved the Jews. So he writes to Ptolemy, to another king, the king of Egypt. He writes in a letter. He says, since the Jews upon our first entrance on their country demonstrated their friendship towards us, and he goes recounting all sorts of friendly things they did, he says, we have thought fit to reward them. And then he goes through a bunch of rewards, and I kind of skipped that. And he says, in the first place, we have determined, on account of their piety towards God, to bestow on them, as pension for their sacrifices of animals that are fit for sacrifice, for wine and oil and frankincense, the value of 20,000 pieces of silver, or 6 sacred arbitrary of fine flour, with 1,460 midmini of wheat, and 375 midmini of salt. So what I want you to see is, I want you to see meat being offered for sacrifices by Antiochus III. So he said, I'm going to give a stipend to Jews, and they can buy animal for the sacrifices and sacrifice them to their God, because I'm going to help their worship. And I'm also going to give them flour. I'm also going to give them, you know, all these different resources. And one of those staples, you know, along with wine and oil and flour and meat for the sacrifice, he brings in salt. Why? Of course, because salt was also used for sacrifices as well. So you could see it. You kind of get the idea that this is a pretty important staple. And he actually, one of the documents talks about taxes that are being levied. And he says, by the way, I forgive you the salt tax. You can pay all the other taxes, but the salt tax, you can let that one go. So things like that. It was a commodity that was actually taxed separately. Just like people today tax certain substances at a higher tax rate, I imagine a salt was taxed at a special tax rate. It was a commodity. So here's major practical purposes of salt that I kind of, you know, bring up even today and antiquity, more so sometimes antiquity than today. But we have seasoning. Obviously, everybody cooks with salt. Why? Because it enhances the flavor of pretty much anything you cook. Food preservation, yes. Dehydration, you can use that with salt. Soil enhancement, you can actually put a little bit of salt. Salt has minerals, and it makes the soil more productive. If you put too much salt, you devastate the soil. You make it unproductive, because too much of anything is a bad thing, pretty much. Pretty much applies to everything. I can't think of substances that too much of anything will be a good thing. And so too much salt, devastation. Currency transactions were used, so you could trade salt. You can use it as a bartering tool. You could trade it for items because it has worth and value, and it's very easily to measure by weight. People were using for washing and for cleaning and for scrubbing. You can use salt in a lot of ways, like you use today baking soda, something like that. So you have something cooked onto a pot, you take coarse salt and you rub it on it, and it actually gets that stuff off, okay? So people did use that. They used it as a mineral supplement for cattle. we even today put out salt licks, right? You know, for deer. There's a reason why deer are attracted to salt licks and things like that. And well, guess what? Domestic cattle is as well. You put out a salt lick for sheep, for example. They come and they get their minerals from that. Goats climb crazy mountains to get little streams of water coming down. Why? Because there's salt coming out, minerals coming out through the rock, seeping through the water. And so you'll see mountain goats going crazy places to get their salt lick, essentially. That's what they're doing. So mineral supplements is a good, important feature of salt. And then also medicinal and beauty application. People do not realize that salt has been used as a medicinal substance. Sometimes you need to clean something out. You can use salt. Wash things out with a salty water, for example, to disinfect, things like that. You would use salt, you would use oil, and you would use wine, actually, in medicinal applications. And so you need to rinse things out. You need to take the inflammation of something down. You rinse it out with salt water. And beauty applications, of course, even today, people use baths and they put salts in their baths, right? And things like that. Dead Sea products, I mean, come on, you get the idea. Why? Because it has minerals, it has all sorts of qualities that are helpful to you. So yeah, there's major practical purposes of salt. Now the question is this what Yeshua means when he calls his disciples the salt of the earth? Is that the practical types of applications, the uses that we hear about? Oh, salt can preserve food, salt can do this, salt can do that. You know, is that what Yeshua says? You're the salt of the earth. They go, no. The hunch is, no. He probably means something a bit more spiritual. These things might be all good things in mind, but there's probably something else there beyond these mundane, practical, daily uses of salt that he means. So the question is, what can he possibly mean when he says you're the salt of the earth? What's the message behind it? If it is an indirect or more idiomatic way of saying something important about his disciples, what is he saying? Now, most of the commentators are going to tell you, oh, you know, disciples, they're meant to preserve the earth. You know, the earth is not destroyed because the disciples are there. See, that's going back to the practical application of salt, right? Or you know, what are some of your ideas? How you guys think beyond practical? Because every single commentary you can pick up on those shelves is going to go for one of these meanings.
Usually, most of the commentaries I've read tend to go towards the preservative idea and start tying into the idea of the 10 righteous would have been enough to save Sodom, and therefore the righteous dwelling in the midst of the wicked serve to preserve the wicked from that. Hugh Ross makes an interesting point that the kind of complete destruction of whole civilizations that we see in the ancient world, like where Nineveh was so completely destroyed that for a long time people thought it was a myth. You don't really see after the gospel starts to go out into the world. And so that perhaps this is because
the gospel is the salt. Yeah.
Perhaps this is because, you know, having righteous people living among the wicked, God is not pouring out his wrath in the same way he used to. Is the usual idea that I see.
That's the usual idea that it kind of goes along. So I'm trying to coax you guys to come out from the normal borderlines.
I guess I feel like when he tells Israel that they're to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation as example, so to speak.
Yeah.
I think there's a connect. It's kind of it's a vague connection, so I haven't crystallized it. No pun intended.
Hey,
but,
work it out.
But I feel like there's something there.
That's good. No, we can work it out. It could be a definition in progress, you know, kind of that's growing on you. Anybody else?
Peter, I think that one aspect of this is the good news that they had
Okay.
to give to the world,
Okay.
the knowledge that they had acquired in their time with Messiah.
Good.
That made them a special flavor to the world.
Flavor,
Made
value.
them, it caused them to be able to offer spiritual preservation. It also, I mean, all of these things, they were given gifts to pursue that task, which included healing.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at all these things from that aspect, they had all those properties by virtue of their knowledge and what they had to share with the world.
Good. See, there's some more connections, and we're still working kind of the practical list there.
So you have to have so much salt for life. Like if your salt levels get off, well, my grandmother's day, you should went out of her mind. So you have to have so much to live. And I think he was saying you have life. You have the keys.
You have life. Ooh. Okay, so that idiomatically, salt equals life. You're alive. You got something going on in you.
Salt is also in the ancient Near East sort of emblematic of covenant and friendship. You know, once you ate of somebody's salt at their table, you were given guest right, and they would protect you, and in turn, you were in a sort of a covenant relationship with your host.
Excellent. I was waiting for somebody to say that. That's awesome. Why? Because I got a couple of slides for you guys. Up on that line, I was hoping you were going to get me there. All right. So here's a couple for you. This is fun. You're going to enjoy this. This is a text called the Testament of Solomon. It's from a first century. It's a first century Jewish text that was kind of edited and tweaked and messed with by certain generations of Christian scribes and then later by monks. And so it kind of got messed up a little bit, but essentially it's a Jewish document. So it's ascribed to Solomon. Solomon didn't write it. He is talking to demons now. It's the whole entire text is about demons and angels and things like that. So Solomon is talking to demons. It says, "Then I commanded another demon to appear before me. There came to me 36 heavenly bodies, and their heads were like formless dogs, but there were among them those who were in the form of humans or bulls or dragons with faces like birds or beasts or sphinx." He's talking about demons, by the way, heavenly bodies. I don't know if you didn't realize that. Right? Demons are, the ammonia are heavenly beings. They're otherworldly beings. Not heavenly in the sense like godly, but heavenly in the sense like from another world. That's what we're talking about. So he says, the 13th demon, I skip a whole bunch in there, because he's talking to each of his demons in detail. Each one of them, Solomon is having a conversation with. So he gets the 13th demon, and the 13th demon answers and says to him, I am called Reichs Koreth. You know, I bring on long-term illnesses. If anyone puts salt into olive oil and massages his sickly body with it, saying, okay, cherubim, seraphim, help me, I retreat immediately. See, so here's the incantation for you to drive away the demon that caused long-term illness. So this is like a recipe book, you know. You're sick for a long time. Take olive oil, mix it with salt, rub it all over your body, and you have to say, cherubim, seraphim, help me. And that demon flees that caused that sickness. He's gone. So it's a beautiful passage from first century, again. Believe it or not believe it, it's just Jewish lore, okay? And recipe for healing, essentially. But it's interesting that they're using salt, mixing it with olive oil, and of course incantation that goes along with, well, incantation, or you can call it prayer, request, because God is the one who has power over demons. So that's the idea. Okay, so that's one example for you. Here's another one. Demosthenes, this is from one of his speeches, so something from a Greco-Roman world, okay? This is 3rd century BCE, so this is going way, way back in the time. So Demosthenes is having a little bit of a problem with some of his comrades at the table, and he is lamenting this one fellow, and he says, hark to his melodramatic whine, and then he quotes his fellow symposiast. He says, where is the salt of friendship? See that phrase right there? Salt of friendship. And he goes on, where is the genial board? Where is the cup of communion? Interesting, right? As if doers of justice, not doers of iniquity, were traitors to those symbols. I know that the presidents unite in a sacrificial service, dine together and make libation together. But it does not follow that the honest men take their cue from the knaves. As soon as they deduct one of themselves in misconduct, they lay information before the council and the assembly. So Demosthenes in his speech essentially is calling for justice, calling for righteousness, and says, hey, we got a due process over here. But what I want you to notice is that when he quotes one of his comrades, he says, where is the salt of friendship? Now, do you really think they were sitting together and getting their cups and says, hey, let's eat some salt? No, they're talking about food. But they're using word salt idiomatically to represent food. Salt of friendship means the dinner we shared together, which, by the way, was seasoned with salt. So you kind of get the idea. The word salt actually idiomatically represents food. You got it. That's exactly what it is. So there's a lot of those everywhere in the Bible. So can you possibly imagine that something similar is going on in Yeshua's statement, you are the salt of the earth? That he's actually not talking about salt, but kind of using that word idiomatically. That stands for something else, actually represents a concept or an idea. In this case, it represents dining together, eating together, salt of friendship. You know, could be. So let's get into the Bible, and that might give us a little bit more context of what are the types of things that Hebrews would be enlightened by when they hear the word salt. Because so far I gave you kind of the general Mediterranean milieu. So salt occurs in the Bible in a variety of different places. For example, we read in 2 Chronicles 13:5 where God makes a irrevocable covenant of salt with the house of David. You're familiar with that passage, right? Where God makes a covenant with David and he says this is permanent, this is forever, and it is called a covenant of salt. Look at this. Do you not know that the Lord, okay, here's Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh right here, God's name, Hashem, God of Israel, gave the rule over to Israel forever to David and to his sons as a Berit Melach. Look at that. Berit Melach, covenant of salt. So the covenant of salt is how God describes the rule that he gives to David and to his family. It's pretty cool. So that's one of the really common and actually very pervasive meanings throughout the Hebrew Bible, where the salt is somehow tied with a covenant. Interesting. Now, salt was added to the mincha sacrifices. For example, in Leviticus, if you read a passage in the Torah of Leviticus where it says, "V'chol korban mechnuchatecha," and all of the offering, which is your mincha offering, okay, it says, "Bamelach timlach." So, salted with the salt. That's what it says. So you salt with the salt the mincha, okay? Mechnuchatecha, your korban menuchatecha, your offering of mincha. And now, of course, that becomes a symbol of God's faithfulness. Why? Because salt is valuable, salt is provision, salt is life. We've already connected it. Salt does mean food idiomatically. So this is, why would you salt food giving, the food that you give to God? For the same exact reasons, because of the symbolic meaning of the word salt. And by what that substance actually means to you. And by the way, the Olah sacrifices were also salted. You can read that detail in the Torah. You can read it in Ezekiel 43 as well. Now, here's something that I did not know before I set out to kind of look deeper into salt. I did not realize that the besamim, okay, the spices in the temple that were burned as part of the incense, as part of the aroma rising up to God, they were also mixed with salt. I did not realize that. As I sat down and looked at the Hebrew text, sure enough, so Exodus 30, if you read that passage, Exodus 30, 34 to 36, is going to describe the spices as, it says, memulach, okay? And then it says, and it also calls that besamim tahor and kodesh. So it is going to be salted. Memulach is actually a verb. It's salted, pure, holy. That's a description of the besamim. Salted, pure, holy. So that, to me, that means that there was salt in that mix. Whatever that mix was, as secretive as it might have been, we know some of the ingredients in there in the Torah. We don't know the proportions, but we got it. So besamim were salted. Sacrifices, olah, and you have mincha salted. You kind of get the idea that salt is really tied to the whole entire system in the tabernacle, in the temple. Salt can even symbolize God's judgment. And we already kind of hinted at that because the Sodom and Gomorrah, okay, they became the place of what? Salt. Salt and brimstone and fire, and there's nothing living there. And the reason why nothing's living there because it got oversalted.
Well, from what I understand, the city was actually that was their economy. They were near the Dead Sea anyway, and so they supposedly became rich off of the fact that they were big exporters of salt. And so it's almost as though to say that the thing that they did was their undoing, or something like that.
Interesting. I mean, it's an interesting theory. I heard it. I tend to think that that whole entire region was not salty at all at that particular era because it was the most fertile valley for people to be in. For it to be extremely salty would make it unfertile, actually. So there's a lot of interesting geographical ideas that we have to explore there. I don't know how salty that place was in the days of Abraham and Lot, for example. Like to what degree, right? Yeah, Dan.
And it also says that it was well watered.
Okay, there you go.
Well watered.
Yeah.
Yeah, the plain of the Jordan, the word is actually kikar, which literally means the disk of the Jordan. There was a place where, in addition to the Jordan River coming into the Dead Sea, there were multiple springs that fed into it. So you had a big disk of really fertile land right there, and that's where Sodom and Gomorrah were. And then, evidently, when the judgment came, the springs, everything except for the Jordan, were dried up, and so the whole place became completely infertile.
Yeah, the geography of that area has changed drastically. Let's put it that way. And part of it could be the reason of God's judgment and His will and what He wanted to do with that area. And so, as a result, that's what happened, right? But still, it could be judgment, because that's exactly what Zephaniah says how Sodom and Gomorrah were judged. Everything was turned into salt and sulfur. Okay, so it could be judgment. It could also be curses of the covenant, by the way. If you read Deuteronomy 29, you know, that chapter that always makes me shudder when I read it, okay? It talks about one of the curses of the covenant. That God says, you don't obey my Torah, I'm going to make your land desolate. And it's going to be salted. And it's going to be unproductive and unfertile. You're not going to be able to get the living out of the land if you don't follow my commandments. So it could be, this is one of the, believe it or not, it's one of the curses of the covenant. And so, yeah, it kind of has a negative side to it, and like all things in life. But here's an interesting thing. While all these uses appear kind of diverse, I mean, I've taken you through a bunch of different verses that would kind of hint it around. There's a pervasive theme of God's covenant that runs through all of these examples. Binds them all together. This idea of berit milah, okay? The covenant of salt, or the salt covenant, that's the big picture. In the end, all of the verses about sacrifices or anything, there's this idea that somehow covenant and salt are tied idiomatically. And that's what I'm trying to suggest to you. I'm trying to suggest that there's a meaning of covenant that runs kind of like a silver lining through this idea of salt. And if that is true, that puts the words that Yeshua speaks to his disciples in a slightly different light than what we're used to hear them, like preservation, for example. Does the covenant preserve you? Yes, the covenant does preserve you, by the way, too. Because if you do the things of the covenant, it'll be well for you in the land, right? If you don't, you see what's coming. So the second word, we got salt, we also have land. Let's talk a little bit about this idea of land. Yeshua's teaching uses the word gay, which actually, gay means, is eretz in Hebrew, does not carry the global meaning of planet Earth. So let's get that clear. When it says you are the salt of the earth, is not talking about salt of the entire world, or the hemisphere, or even the continent. He's actually talking about land. Okay, so Yeshua's words are focused on his disciples, there to proclaim his message throughout all the land of Israel. And this is what land means. Even in the prayers today, okay, when we say word land, we know exactly which land we mean, right? Okay, so let's say, for example, during Birchat Hamazon, it says, Ve'alcha aretz ve'al hamazon. We say, for the land and for the meal. Which land? The land of the Canaanites, the land of the Philistines? No, we land Israel, the land of the promise. There's only one land. There's the land, and everything else is not, right? So this is the idiomatic idea. When he says, you are the salt of the land, meaning land of Israel, not earth as in global planet idea. So, and that is what's key here. Now take the word covenant, the meaning of covenant that I'm trying to bring into this idea of salt, and blend it together, and it makes perfect sense. The land is the only land that actually has the covenant. There's no other lands that God called his possession, his belonging. There's no other covenants for which you get, there are no other lands for mistreating which you get chastised. Okay? When the children of Israel go into Babylon, God says, I am sending you there because you did not respect the Shemitah. You did not let the land get its Shabbat. So you abuse the land, I punish you. Why? Because it's my land. It's special. It's different. And that's what we mean when we say haaretz, right? The land. So when Yeshua says, you are the salt of the land, he actually literally means you are the salt of Israel as a territory, as this area. Now, I know that makes those words not as global as most of us like to think about them. That's a little bit problematic. It's problematic for context outside of Israel, most of the part. But, of course, the whole earth is the Lord's, right? Of course, the whole world belongs to God. So we can take these verses, we can take these words and take them a little bit broader. You can make a broader and more general application to these words, not as in only the land of Israel, but take it broader. Yes. But such application should not and would not negate the original meaning of Yeshua's words, which is, you are the salt of Israel. See, just because we can take that broader, because the whole world is the Lord's, right? That doesn't negate what Yeshua said. It doesn't change it. It's still just as valid as anything else. And the key is for people to keep in mind that the actual contextual meaning of what Yeshua says is about Israel, not about the whole world. That's not replaced the meanings, is what I'm trying to say. Okay? So by calling the disciples the salt of the land of Israel, Yeshua basically says that you are the proof of God's covenant with his people. You're the proof. You're the salt. You're the salt of the covenant. There's a covenant that I have, and you are the salt. You are the tangible, real proof. So salt is, and the salt of the covenant, the relationship, the prosperity, the well-being, God's reign. This is what all the types of things that come to mind when we think about covenant. And he says, you are the salt of all that. Now the next verse, if you want to test your hypothesis, the next verse is a parallel. You are the light of the world, right? And then Yeshua goes on, talks about, of course, Israel is to be the light of the nations, right? You are the light of the world. When he says you are the light of the world, he's actually being quite literal by saying, hey, you forgot, Israelites? You're supposed to be shining your light not just in the land here, not just to yourselves. You're actually meant for a little bit broader purpose too. Okay? A city on a hill which cannot be hidden, right? So it still works. The idea that you are the salt of the covenant, you are the very core of this idea. You're the proof of my covenant with you. Don't hide it. Shine it. Because the truth is that if you understand that the salt of the earth is really a semantic reference to God's covenant, and that means reference to his commandments and kingdom, well, then just keep reading the rest of the sermon. Because the next thing that Yeshua says is, do not think I came to abolish the Torah and the prophets. Which is still what? The covenant. Because if I'm talking about you are the salt of the covenant, you're the proof of the covenant. Now go shine your light before men that they will see your good works and praise the Father. Meaning, do the Torah, right? This, by the way, I didn't come to abolish the Torah or the prophets. Do you see how all of that all of a sudden works? But not necessarily if you take the whole idea of preservation and kind of salting your food or anything like that, the flavoring, the preservation. That doesn't take you to any of those verses. You can't connect that as easily with the rest of the sermon that comes along. But if you understand the salt is the salt of the covenant, and the covenant is with Israel, and the covenant is with the land of Israel, then it all starts to flow together. And the covenant means commandments, okay? And so he tells them, do the Torah, shine your light to the whole world. You are the proof of God's presence in this world. Don't stop it. Don't stop shining. I think that's still speaks to us. Does it not? That's what I think. So these are a few thoughts that I want to share with you guys.
I really like that because obviously a lot of us are fond of camping out on that verse where he says we haven't abandoned, he's not come to destroy, meaning that's a popular verse. But it's always been kind of a non sequitur from what came just before it. So I like that.
Yeah, so I just tied it all together. Does that make sense? Because these things have to work together. Otherwise, if we chop them up, and the worst thing that we possibly can, I think that we've done is taken the Bible and put chapters and verses in it. It's just a bad idea. I mean, I understand we need it. It's good for reference, but it also makes us read and segment things in places where they shouldn't be segmented. And when we take those things away, I think the whole text starts to flow, or it has to flow. You have to sit down, you have to reason through it as a unit rather than tiny little chunks, little dictums of truth that you can meditate on. That's not how it is. It's the whole cohesive message. So when I read the Sermon on the Mount, when I read that, you're the salt of the earth, you're the light of the world. Do not put light under a bushel. You're the city on a hill. Shine your light before all men. To me, that's just all one big message. It's not that salt is one message, light is another message, and I did not come to abolish the law and the prophets is a third message. To me, it's just one long message, actually. It's kind of like a unit. So when you start looking at it that way, and you say, well, what is the salt in light of everything else? That's how I make sense of it. So hopefully, I showed you guys something new and different in the verse that you already know.